"Don't touch my car," the billionaire shouted at the homeless black man, not knowing this stranger was about to save his $4.2 million hypercar and change his entire worldview. Smoke poured from the Quantum Nova's engine in Silicon Valley's tech district as billionaire Michael Rogers frantically dialed his phone. Nobody answered. The crowd grew. The proprietary engine, unfixable outside the factory, continued its death rattle. "Sir, your quantum thrust cooling system has a micro-fracture in the secondary loop," said the disheveled man approaching with hands slightly raised. "I can fix it." Michael's finger hovered over the security number. How could this man possibly know about technology so classified the manufacturer wouldn't even acknowledge it existed? What hidden genius was standing before him? And why was he living on the streets? In the next 60 seconds, everything Michael believed about talent, worth, and judgment would shatter completely. Where are you listening from today? Drop a comment and subscribe to Beat Stories for moments of extraordinary justice that will change how you see the world. Theo Miller hadn't always lived on the streets. 3 years ago, he designed revolutionary cooling systems that transformed aerospace technology and saved countless lives. Now he slept under the open sky, an invisible man to the tech executives who rushed past without a glance. The morning had started like any other. Theo woke at dawn in his carefully hidden spot behind the abandoned machine shop near Tech Row in Palo Alto. He folded his tarp with military precision, a habit from his engineering days when precision meant survival. His routine was methodical: wash up at the public restroom, brush teeth, and head to the Stanford Public Library as soon as it opened. Knowledge remained his one connection to his former life. Theo had been watching the distinctive Quantum Nova for weeks. These hypercars occasionally glided through the neighborhood on their way to the exclusive tech campus in Mountain View. He recognized the engine's unique purr. He should, considering he'd helped design its predecessor during his brief consultancy at Aerotech Industries before everything fell apart. Caltech graduate, 3 engineering degrees, holder of 7 patents that generated millions for companies that no longer acknowledged his existence. The irony wasn't lost on Theo that he could recite complex thermodynamic equations but couldn't get past a hiring manager's prejudiced gaze. Overqualified, they said when they bothered to interview him. Not a cultural fit, they muttered when his credentials couldn't be denied. The real reasons hung unspoken in the air: a black man from the wrong side of Oakland. No permanent address. The gap in his employment history after the false accusations that had destroyed his career. This morning, Theo had noticed something wrong with the hypercar before it even pulled to the curb near Market Street. The sound was off, a subtle irregularity in the engine's rhythm that only someone intimately familiar with its design would recognize. Michael Rogers, founder of Pinnacle Innovations, had just ended another fruitless call. His frustration was evident as the gathering crowd whispered and pointed at the smoking luxury vehicle. The billionaire's reputation was on the line as much as his investment. "Step back from the vehicle, please," Michael said, not even looking Theo in the eye. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Sir, I really can help," Theo persisted, maintaining a respectful distance. "That specific model has a known issue with the quantum thrust cooling system, the secondary loop. How would you know anything about this car?" Michael cut him off, finally looking directly at Theo. His gaze took in the worn clothes, the unkempt appearance, the reusable grocery bag that contained Theo's worldly possessions. "Because I helped design the prototype cooling system it's based on," Theo replied steadily. A burst of laughter escaped Michael's lips, sharp, incredulous, cutting. Several onlookers joined in nervously. "Right. And I'm teaching rocket science at UC Berkeley on weekends." What happened next would prove just how wrong first impressions can be. And how quickly fortunes can change when desperation meets hidden genius in the heart of Silicon Valley. "Don't touch my car," the billionaire had shouted, but now Michael Rogers watched nervously as smoke continued pouring from his $4.2 million Quantum Nova. The crowd in Silicon Valley's tech district had grown larger, phones pointed at the spectacle, while the homeless man named Theo Miller stood calmly beside the dying hypercar. Step back from the vehicle, please, Michael said, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. His frustration was evident as he ended another fruitless call to Pinnacle Motors customer service. 2 hours minimum, they'd told him. The specialized diagnostic equipment needs to be transported from our San Francisco facility. Sir, I really can help, Theo persisted, maintaining a respectful distance from the smoking engine. That specific model has a known issue with the quantum thrust cooling system. The secondary loop develops stress fractures under certain temperature conditions. How would you know anything about this car? Michael cut him off, his gaze taking in Theo's worn Oakland Raiders jacket and the frayed backpack that contained his worldly possessions. This vehicle contains technology that cost us millions to develop. Even most certified mechanics can't service it. Theo met his gaze steadily. Because I helped design the prototype cooling system it's based on at Aerotech Industries. Patent number at 5729QX, registered 4 years ago in California. Your car's system is a modified version of my original thermal regulation design. A security officer from the nearby Pinnacle Innovations campus approached, having been called by concerned onlookers. Mr. Rogers, is there a problem here? We received reports of someone tampering with your vehicle. This gentleman claims he can fix my hypercar, Michael replied, uncertainty creeping into his voice. The diagnostic system was now showing 47 minutes until catastrophic engine failure. But I'm not sure. Sir, the security officer addressed Theo firmly, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the vehicle. This is proprietary technology. Wait, Michael held up a hand. Something in Theo's calm confidence was beginning to penetrate his skepticism. You mentioned patent at 5729QX. How do you know that specific number? Because my name is on it, Theo replied simply. Theo Miller, former lead thermal engineer at Spacetech Industries in Palo Alto. I developed the quantum thermal regulation system that your car's cooling architecture is based on. The security officer pulled out his tablet, quickly searching patent databases. His expression changed as he found the filing. Mr. Rogers, he said quietly, there is a Theo Miller listed as primary inventor on several thermal engineering patents. MIT graduate, former consultant to Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Michael stared at Theo with new eyes. If that's true, why are you? He gestured vaguely at Theo's circumstances. Living on the streets? Theo supplied the words Michael was reluctant to say. It's a long story involving false accusations, corporate politics, and the difficulty of rebuilding when the system decides you're disposable. But right now, your car has approximately 43 minutes before that microfracture causes irreparable damage to the quantum stabilization core. A Channel 7 news van pulled up, having heard reports of the unusual scene. Michael's anxiety spiked, his reputation, his company's image, all potentially at risk if this situation spiraled out of control. What exactly would you need to do? Michael asked, desperation beginning to override his caution. Access to your emergency repair kit, which should contain basic thermal sealant, Theo explained with professional precision. I'll also need graphite from a very specific type of pencil, Staedtler Mars Lumograph 8B grade, which I noticed they sell at that convenience store across the street. With those materials, I can create a temporary molecular bond that will stabilize the fracture until you can get proper factory repair. The security officer looked skeptical. You're going to fix a multi-million-dollar vehicle with pencil lead? Graphite nanoparticles have excellent thermal conductivity properties when properly suspended in polymer sealant, Theo replied calmly. It's a technique I developed for emergency repairs on spacecraft cooling systems. Not elegant, but effective. Michael checked his watch again. The investor meeting he couldn't afford to miss was in 2 hours. The San Mateo tech investors had specifically requested to see the Quantum Nova as proof of Pinnacle Innovations' cutting-edge capabilities. Sir, the security officer said quietly, this is highly irregular. If something goes wrong. It's already wrong, Michael interrupted, looking at the diagnostic warning that now read 39 minutes to critical failure. He turned to Theo. If you damage my car. It's already damaged, Theo replied evenly, and getting worse by the minute. The question is whether you'll trust my expertise before it's too late to save. The news crew was setting up their camera. A small crowd had gathered, many filming with their phones. Michael realized he was at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but potentially his entire perspective on judgment, talent, and worth. Get the pencils, he finally said to the security officer. Then, to Theo, show me what you can do. As Theo rolled up his sleeves and approached the smoking hypercar, neither man could predict how completely their lives were about to change, or how a moment of desperate trust would reveal truths about genius, prejudice, and the courage required to see beyond surface appearances. The real test was just beginning, and Silicon Valley was about to witness something that would challenge everything its elite thought they knew about talent and worth. The security officer returned from the CVS pharmacy across from the Google campus, clutching a package of Staedtler Mars Lumograph 8B pencils. These better be worth $23, he muttered, handing them to Theo. Theo examined the pencils with the practiced eye of an expert. Perfect graphite density. This will work. He opened Michael's emergency repair kit, a sleek carbon fiber case that contained tools most people would never recognize. The Channel 7 news crew had finished setting up, their camera now focused on the unusual scene. Reporter Maria Santos spoke quietly into her microphone. We're witnessing an extraordinary situation here in Palo Alto, where a homeless man claims he can repair what may be the most technologically advanced vehicle in the world. Before I begin, Theo addressed the crowd that had grown to nearly 60 people. I want everyone to understand what's happening here. This isn't magic, it's applied physics and chemistry. The microfracture in the secondary cooling loop is allowing the specialized nanocoolant to leak into the tertiary chamber, where it's vaporizing against the thermal shielding. He pointed to specific components visible through the engine bay vents. The quantum stabilization system requires coolant temperatures to remain within a range of plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius. When contaminated coolant reaches critical temperature, it causes a cascade failure that destroys the quantum thrust bearings, components that cost approximately $870,000 to replace and take 11 weeks to manufacture. Michael found himself nodding along, despite his lingering doubts. The technical details were beyond his expertise, but Theo spoke with the confidence of someone who had designed these systems from the ground up. The factory repair protocol requires complete disassembly because they assume worst-case contamination, Theo continued, removing the graphite core from one of the pencils with surgical precision. But with this specific leak pattern, we can isolate the affected section, seal the fracture, and restore functionality without disassembly. A Stanford University engineering student in the crowd raised her phone higher. This is going to be my thesis project, she whispered to her friend. Improvised nanotechnology repair in field conditions. Theo began mixing the emergency sealant with carefully measured graphite particles in a small container from the repair kit. The emergency sealant is designed for primary cooling system repairs, but by infusing it with graphite nanoparticles of this specific density, I can create a compound that will bond effectively with the specialized alloy of the secondary loop. Dar. Elena Rodriguez, a materials science professor from UC Berkeley who happened to be driving by, had stopped to watch. She approached Michael quietly. Excuse me, but do you know who this man is? The technique he's describing, graphite nanoparticle infusion for thermal regulation, that's revolutionary work. I've seen papers on this, but I thought it was purely theoretical. He claims he invented it, Michael replied, uncertainty still evident in his voice. The quantum stabilization chamber is here, Theo said, pointing to a component deep in the engine compartment. If the leaked coolant reaches critical temperature, which the diagnostic system indicates will happen in approximately 11 minutes, it will cause molecular destabilization of the quantum field generators. At that point, you won't just need new bearings. You'll need an entirely new engine core. The diagnostic system chimed as if on cue, warning, 11 minutes to critical system failure. I need complete concentration for this next part, Theo announced. The application must be precise, and I'll have only one attempt. He looked directly at Michael. The molecular bond must form at exactly the right temperature and pressure. If I miscalculate by even a few degrees, the repair will fail and accelerate the damage. The crowd fell silent. Even the Google employees who had come out of their nearby building to watch stopped their conversations. Maria Santos lowered her microphone, not wanting to risk interfering with the delicate work. Theo's hands moved with the steady precision of a surgeon. He carefully applied the compound to the microscopic fracture, his movements economical and confident. The years of homelessness hadn't diminished his technical skills; if anything, the necessity of improvisation had sharpened them. The molecular bond is forming, he murmured, monitoring the chemical reaction by observing subtle color changes in the sealant. Temperature is holding steady. Pressure looks good. Minutes stretched like hours. The only sounds were the faint hiss of the cooling system and the distant hum of traffic on Highway 101. Michael checked his phone compulsively. 8 minutes until failure. 6 minutes. 4 minutes. Almost there, Theo said quietly. I need to vent the contaminated coolant now and restore system pressure. He reached deeper into the engine compartment, manipulating components with the familiarity of someone who had designed them personally. A thin stream of iridescent fluid began to drain into a container he had improvised from the emergency kit's case. That's about $18,000 worth of nano-coolant, he explained matter-of-factly. We're saving approximately 60% of it, which is better than I expected. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, fascinated. The molecular structure of that coolant, it's designed for quantum field stability, isn't it? I've never seen it outside a laboratory setting. I helped develop the formula, Theo replied without looking up from his work. The manufacturing process involves quantum-stabilized carbon nanotubes suspended in a proprietary polymer matrix. The cost has probably increased since I last worked on it, but the fundamental chemistry remains the same. The diagnostic alert chimed, warning, 2 minutes to critical system failure. Theo appeared completely calm. He continued working steadily, now refilling the system with reserve coolant from the emergency kit. Standard formulation, he explained as he worked. Not ideal for the secondary loop, but it will allow safe operation until you can get the specialized nano-coolant replaced. You'll need to keep engine output below 70% capacity. 30 seconds to critical failure, the system warned. Theo made one final adjustment, then carefully secured the access panel. Start the engine, he instructed. Michael hesitated. Are you absolutely certain? Start the engine, Theo repeated with quiet authority. Michael reached inside the vehicle and pressed the ignition. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the Quantum Nova's engine came to life with its distinctive sound, a high-pitched whine that quickly modulated to a deep, powerful purr that was somehow even smoother than before. No smoke emerged from the engine bay. The diagnostic screen flickered, then displayed, system stabilizing. Quantum thrust cooling functional. Performance limited to 70% capacity. Service recommended within 30 days. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Several people were recording with their phones, and Maria Santos was speaking rapidly into her microphone. The Stanford student was practically jumping with excitement, already composing her thesis outline in her head. Michael stared at the diagnostic readout in disbelief. That's impossible, he muttered. Pinnacle Motors said this repair couldn't be done in the field under any circumstances. Manufacturers often overcomplicate things to maintain their service monopoly, Theo replied, wiping his hands on a cloth from the emergency kit. The repair isn't difficult if you understand the fundamental principles of quantum thermodynamics and have access to the right materials. Dr. Rodriguez pushed forward through the crowd. Sir, I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez from UC Berkeley's Materials Science Department. What you just accomplished, the field application of quantum thermal regulation theory, it's extraordinary. Are you available for consultation? We have research grants that. One thing at a time, Theo said with a slight smile. It was the first time anyone had seen him look truly pleased. Michael extended his hand to Theo. "I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. And an apology. I judged you based on appearances instead of capabilities, and that was wrong." Theo accepted the handshake. "Apology accepted. But the real test isn't whether you can acknowledge your mistake, it's whether you learn from it." As the crowd began to disperse, phones buzzing with notifications as videos and posts spread across social media, neither Theo nor Michael realized that this moment would become the catalyst for changes that would ripple far beyond Silicon Valley, challenging an entire industry's assumptions about talent, worth, and the true meaning of genius. The homeless man who had been invisible to the tech world for 3 years was about to become impossible to ignore. As the crowd dispersed and the Quantum Nova hummed quietly with its restored engine, Michael Rogers found himself unable to simply drive away. Something profound had shifted in his understanding, and the weight of that realization anchored him to the spot where his worldview had just crumbled and rebuilt itself in the span of 30 minutes. "Dr. Rodriguez," he called to the UC Berkeley professor who was still examining the repair work with scientific fascination. "You mentioned research grants. What kind of work are you doing that would interest someone like Theo?" "Quantum thermal regulation for next-generation processors," she replied enthusiastically. "We're trying to solve heat dissipation problems in quantum computing arrays. The techniques I just witnessed, field application of nanoparticle thermal bonding, that's exactly what we need. We've been working on theoretical models for 2 years, but what this gentleman accomplished in 20 minutes represents a breakthrough." Theo had been quietly cleaning his hands and organizing the tools back into Michael's emergency kit. "Your theoretical models probably assume laboratory conditions," he said without looking up. "Real-world application requires adaptation to environmental variables, temperature fluctuations, contamination factors, material degradation over time." Dr. Rodriguez pulled out her phone. "Would you be willing to look at our research? We have funding for consultants, and frankly, after what I just witnessed, I think you might revolutionize our entire approach." "I appreciate the offer," Theo replied, "but I should mention that I don't currently have a phone, email address, or permanent residence. The traditional consultant arrangement might be complicated." Michael watched this exchange with growing discomfort. Here was a man who had just saved his $4.2 million investment with improvised materials and expertise that apparently exceeded that of university researchers, and he was homeless. The contradiction was so stark it felt almost surreal. "Theo," Michael said, stepping forward, "I'd like to make you an offer. But first, I need to understand something. You said you helped design this cooling system at Aerotech Industries. What happened? How did you end up?" He gestured vaguely, still unable to say the word "homeless" directly. Theo straightened up, meeting Michael's gaze steadily. "It's not a pleasant story, but you deserve to know since you're considering associating with me professionally." He leaned against the Quantum Nova, his demeanor calm but his words carrying the weight of lived experience. 3 years ago, I was lead thermal engineer on a prototype spacecraft cooling system for NASA contractor Advanced Aerospace Systems. The project was worth $200 million and had an impossible deadline imposed by executives who didn't understand the technical constraints. I recommended extending the testing phase by 6 months to address safety concerns I'd identified. Maria Santos, the Channel 7 reporter, had been packing up her equipment but stopped when she realized another layer of the story was unfolding. She discreetly positioned herself where she could continue recording. "The executives overruled my recommendations," Theo continued. "They pressured the testing team to sign off on specifications that hadn't been properly validated. When the prototype failed during the demonstration flight, exactly as I had predicted it would, they needed a scapegoat. I was the obvious choice, the one who had raised concerns, who had delayed the project with his excessive caution." Dr. Rodriguez frowned. "But surely when the investigation proved you were right." "The investigation took 18 months, Theo replied. "By then, I'd been terminated for insubordination, my security clearance had been revoked, and my reputation in the industry was destroyed. Advanced Aerospace eventually settled with NASA for $400 million and quietly implemented all the safety protocols I had originally recommended. But the clearing of my name was buried in legal documents that no one outside the legal departments ever saw. Michael felt a chill of recognition. He'd seen similar scenarios play out in Silicon Valley, engineers who raised inconvenient truths being marginalized when their warnings conflicted with business timelines. But he'd never considered the human cost when those engineers lacked the connections or resources to weather the storm. That still doesn't explain 3 years of homelessness, he said gently. Theo's smile was rueful. Try getting hired when you have no permanent address, when your last employer gives ambiguous references, when your most recent work is classified and can't be discussed in interviews. Add racial bias, ageism, and the simple fact that hiring managers are uncomfortable with gaps in employment history, and you find yourself in a spiral that's remarkably difficult to escape. The Stanford engineering student who had been recording everything approached hesitantly. Sir, I've been researching you while you were talking. There are patents in your name worth millions of dollars. Shouldn't you be receiving royalties? Patent law is complicated, Theo explained patiently. Most of my patents were developed while employed by companies that own the intellectual property. I get credited as the inventor, but the financial benefits belong to the corporations. It's standard practice in the industry. Michael pulled out his phone and quickly searched for Theo's patents. His expression grew increasingly amazed as he scrolled through the results. Quantum thermal regulation system, advanced polymer coolant formulation, nanoparticle heat dissipation matrix. Theo, these patents are foundational to half the cooling systems in the tech industry. Companies are making billions using your innovations. And that's the paradox of American innovation, Theo replied. Individual genius creates the breakthroughs, but corporate structures capture the value. I'm not bitter about it, that's simply how the system works. But it does mean that being the inventor of valuable technology doesn't necessarily translate to personal wealth or security. Michael looked at his repaired hypercar, then back at the man who had saved it. I want to change that. At least in your case. He turned to Dr. Rodriguez. You mentioned research funding. What kind of budget are we talking about? For the right consultant. We have $2.8 million allocated over 3 years for quantum thermal research. If we could solve the heat dissipation problem, it would revolutionize quantum computing efficiency. Theo, Michael said, I'm prepared to offer you something more comprehensive than a consulting arrangement. I want to fund your own research laboratory. Complete autonomy, unlimited budget for the first year, and you keep the patent rights to whatever you develop. All I ask is first option to license your innovations for Pinnacle Innovations. Theo studied Michael's face, looking for signs of insincerity or condescension. That's an extraordinary offer. But I have to ask, why? 30 minutes ago you were ready to have security remove me from your car. Michael had the grace to look embarrassed. Because 30 minutes ago I was judging you based on appearances instead of capabilities. I was making the same mistake that apparently led to 3 years of wasted genius. I can't fix the injustice of what happened to you, but I can make sure it doesn't continue. The crowd that had been dispersing began to gather again, sensing that something significant was happening. Maria Santos stepped forward with her microphone. Mr. Rogers, are you saying you're prepared to fund this gentleman's research based on a single car repair? Michael looked directly into the camera. I'm saying that I just witnessed someone solve a problem that stumped the manufacturer's engineers, using improvised materials and knowledge that clearly represents decades of expertise. If we're serious about innovation in Silicon Valley, we need to recognize genius wherever we find it, not wherever we expect it. He turned back to Theo. What do you say? Are you interested in having your own lab again? For the first time since Michael had met him, Theo's composed demeanor cracked slightly. The weight of 3 years of rejection, dismissal, and invisibility seemed to lift from his shoulders like steam from an overheated engine. I'm very interested, he said quietly. But I have one condition of my own. Name it. I want to establish a program to identify other overlooked talents, people like me who fell through the cracks not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked the social connections or financial resources to weather temporary setbacks. Innovation doesn't only come from people with the right addresses and the right networks. Michael extended his hand. Theo Miller, I think you've just described exactly the kind of program Silicon Valley needs. Consider yourself funded. As they shook hands in the shadow of the repaired quantum nova, neither man could predict how completely this moment would transform not just their own lives, but the entire culture of talent recognition in the tech industry. The homeless man who had been invisible for 3 years was about to become the most visible advocate for systemic change in Silicon Valley's history. 6 months after the viral hypercar repair, Pinnacle Innovation's headquarters in Palo Alto had transformed into something unprecedented in Silicon Valley. The sleek corporate lobby now featured a different kind of display, not just awards and patents, but photographs of diverse engineers, formerly homeless individuals, ex-convicts, and others who had found second chances through the Innovation Recovery Initiative. Theo Miller stood in his state-of-the-art laboratory, surrounded by a team of researchers who looked nothing like the typical Silicon Valley workforce. Sarah Chen, a former foster kid who had taught herself programming in public libraries, was now leading quantum algorithm development. Marcus Williams, who had spent 2 years homeless after a wrongful conviction, had become their lead materials scientist. Rosa Martinez, a single mother who had lost her engineering job during the 2020 pandemic, was pioneering sustainable energy storage solutions. The beauty of necessity-driven innovation, Theo explained to a group of visiting Stanford MBA students, is that it strips away the luxury of conventional thinking. When you've had to solve problems with limited resources, you develop creativity that can't be taught in traditional academic settings. Michael Rogers watched from the laboratory's observation deck, still amazed by what they had built together. The Innovation Recovery Initiative had expanded far beyond their original vision. What started as a simple idea to help overlooked talents had become a $500 million program spanning 32 companies across Silicon Valley, with satellite programs in Detroit, Austin, and Atlanta. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Traditional investors had initially balked at hiring practices that prioritized potential over pedigree. Some board members questioned the wisdom of funding laboratories led by people with non-traditional backgrounds. But the results spoke louder than skepticism. The initiative's participants were generating patents at 3.2 times the industry average, with breakthrough innovations that had already generated over $2.8 billion in revenue across participating companies. Mr. Rogers approached Dr. Elena Rodriguez from UC Berkeley, who had become a key academic partner in the program. The quantum thermal regulation system Theo's team developed is exceeding all our projections. We're seeing 40% efficiency improvements in quantum computing arrays, with applications ranging from climate modeling to pharmaceutical research. This technology could revolutionize everything from drug discovery to weather prediction. Michael nodded, but his attention was drawn to the Wall Street Journal reporter interviewing Theo near the prototype cooling systems. After months of media attention, Theo had become surprisingly adept at translating complex engineering concepts into accessible language for public consumption. The fundamental question, Theo was saying to the reporter, isn't whether homeless individuals or ex-convicts or community college graduates can innovate, it's whether our institutions are willing to recognize innovation when it doesn't arrive with the expected credentials. We've proven that genius doesn't require a Stanford degree or a Menlo Park address. It requires curiosity, persistence, and opportunity. The reporter scribbled notes furiously. Your critics say the initiative is more about social justice than technological advancement. How do you respond to claims that you're prioritizing diversity over merit? Theo's response was calm but pointed. That criticism reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what merit actually means. If merit is measured by results, by patents filed, problems solved, revenues generated, then our participants are outperforming traditional hiring metrics by every objective standard. The real question is why the industry waited so long to tap into this talent pool. Maria Santos from Channel 7 News, who had covered the original hypercar repair, was preparing a 6-month follow-up story. She had tracked down several individuals whose lives had been changed by the initiative, including James Patterson, a former Marine who had struggled with homelessness after returning from Afghanistan. James was now leading cybersecurity development for 3 Fortune 500 companies. 6 months ago, James told Maria's camera, "I was sleeping in my car and couldn't get past the initial phone screening for entry-level IT positions. Today, I'm designing security protocols that protect millions of users." The difference wasn't my technical skills, those hadn't changed. The difference was finding people who were willing to look past my circumstances to see my capabilities. The initiative's success had attracted attention far beyond Silicon Valley. Congressional representatives were studying it as a model for workforce development. European and Asian tech companies were requesting consultations on replicating the program internationally. Harvard Business School had developed 3 case studies examining different aspects of the initiative's implementation and impact. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richard Harrison, the former Advanced Aerospace Systems executive who had fired Theo 3 years earlier, requested a private meeting. When he arrived at Pinnacle Innovations, his demeanor was markedly different from the dismissive authority figure Theo remembered. "I came to apologize," Dr. Harrison said simply, sitting across from Theo in the laboratory's conference room. "And to acknowledge that my decision to terminate you was the worst mistake of my career, not just professionally, but ethically. The safety protocols you recommended, which we ignored, became industry standard after the accident. Your innovations are now core to every thermal management system we develop." Theo listened without apparent emotion, then responded with characteristic precision. "Apologies are meaningful, but systematic change is more valuable. What matters now is whether the industry learns to recognize expertise regardless of where it comes from or what circumstances surround it." Dr. Harrison nodded. "That's actually why I'm here. Advanced Aerospace wants to partner with your initiative. We've identified 47 engineers currently working in non-technical roles, driving trucks, working in warehouses, doing construction, because they couldn't overcome employment gaps or credential barriers. We want to bring them back into aerospace engineering." As the sun set over Silicon Valley, Theo stood on the laboratory's rooftop terrace, looking out at the sprawling tech campus that had once seemed impenetrable. The transformation felt surreal, not just his own journey from homelessness to industry leadership, but the broader cultural shift the initiative had catalyzed. Michael joined him on the terrace, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The Times wants to do a feature story. From homeless to Fortune 500, the Silicon Valley initiative changing everything. Are you interested?" Theo accepted the coffee, considering the question. Only if they focus on the systematic changes, not just individual success stories. The goal was never to rescue a few exceptional people, it was to transform how the industry identifies and develops talent. "Speaking of systematic change," Michael said, "I have news. Microsoft, Apple, and Google announced this afternoon that they're jointly funding a $1.2 billion expansion of the initiative. The program will launch in 15 cities nationwide, with satellite programs internationally." For a moment, Theo's composed facade cracked, revealing the depth of emotion beneath his professional demeanor. 3 years ago, he had been invisible. Dismissed, forgotten. Today, the principles he had advocated were reshaping an entire industry's approach to human capital. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important innovations aren't technological, they're social. We didn't just fix cooling systems and quantum processors. We fixed the systems that were cooling human potential and quantifying worth based on appearances instead of capabilities." As lights began twinkling across the valley below, both men understood that their partnership had created something larger than either had imagined, a movement that would outlive them both, ensuring that genius would be recognized wherever it emerged, regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. The homeless man who had saved a $4.2 million hypercar had helped save something far more valuable, the promise that talent, dedication, and innovation would always find a way to surface, no matter how deeply buried by prejudice or circumstance. 7 years had passed since the smoke first poured from the quantum nova on that fateful morning in Silicon Valley. The world had changed in ways that seemed impossible to predict from that single moment of desperation and trust. Theo Miller stood before the World Economic Forum in Davos, addressing an audience of global leaders, tech moguls, and policymakers who hung on his every word. Innovation, he declared, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once convinced a skeptical billionaire to trust him with a $4.2 million hypercar, is not confined to prestigious laboratories or Ivy League campuses. True innovation emerges wherever curiosity meets opportunity, in homeless shelters, in prison libraries, in community college workshops, in the minds of people society has taught to see themselves as disposable. The audience erupted in sustained applause. Prime ministers and Fortune 500 CEOs rose from their seats. In the 7 years since the Innovation Recovery Initiative had launched, it had fundamentally transformed not just Silicon Valley, but the global approach to talent identification and development. The numbers were staggering. The initiative now operated in 127 cities across 34 countries. Over 890,000 individuals had participated in various programs, from basic skills training to advanced research opportunities. The patent output from initiative participants had exceeded 45,000 filings, generating an estimated $2.7 trillion in economic value worldwide. But statistics, Theo knew, only told part of the story. Marcus Williams, the former homeless man who had become their lead materials scientist, had revolutionized battery technology with his development of graphene-enhanced energy storage systems. His innovations were now powering electric vehicles in 23 countries and had made renewable energy storage commercially viable on a massive scale. Sarah Chen, the former foster child who had taught herself programming in public libraries, had developed quantum encryption algorithms that were protecting the financial transactions of 2.8 billion people worldwide. Major governments had classified her work as critical infrastructure, and she had been invited to consult on national cybersecurity strategies. Rosa Martinez, the single mother who had lost her engineering job during the pandemic, had created sustainable water purification systems that were providing clean drinking water to 45 million people in developing nations. Her technology had been adopted by the United Nations as a cornerstone of their global clean water initiative. These weren't just success stories, they were proof of concept for an entirely different way of thinking about human potential. Michael Rogers watched from the VIP section of the Davos auditorium, still amazed by the trajectory that had begun with his broken hypercar. Pinnacle Innovations was now the third-largest technology company in the world, with 85% of their leadership team having emerged from non-traditional backgrounds. Their innovation per dollar ratio exceeded their competitors by 340%, and their employee satisfaction ratings were the highest in the industry. The transformation hadn't been limited to their company. The entire Silicon Valley ecosystem had evolved. Venture capital firms now allocated mandatory percentages of their portfolios to initiative-affiliated startups. Stanford, Berkeley, and other elite universities had created bridge programs specifically designed to bring community college students and GED recipients into advanced degree programs. The California state legislature had passed the Miller-Rogers Act, requiring state-funded institutions to allocate 15% of their research budgets to programs serving underrepresented innovators. The ripple effects had spread far beyond technology. Medical schools were identifying brilliant diagnosticians among EMT workers and nursing assistants. Engineering programs were discovering architectural visionaries among construction workers and maintenance staff. Business schools were recognizing entrepreneurial genius among street vendors and community organizers. The Obama Foundation, Gates Foundation, and dozens of other philanthropic organizations had provided over $8.9 billion in funding to replicate the initiative's methodologies globally. China, India, Brazil, and the European Union had each launched national versions of the program, adapted to their specific cultural and economic contexts. But perhaps the most profound impact was cultural. The narrative of meritocracy that had long dominated elite institutions, the assumption that talent naturally rose to the top in fair competition, had been permanently shattered. The initiative had proven that genius was evenly distributed across all demographics, but opportunity was not. The question was no longer whether overlooked populations contained brilliance, but why systems had been designed to systematically waste that brilliance. Hollywood had produced 3 major films based on Theo's story, with Academy Award-winning performances that had brought the themes of hidden genius and systemic bias to mainstream popular culture. Documentary series on Netflix and HBO had followed dozens of initiative participants, showing their journeys from marginalization to leadership. Children's books featuring characters inspired by Theo's story were now standard in elementary school libraries worldwide. Universities had created entire academic disciplines around inclusive innovation theory. Business schools taught case studies comparing pre-initiative hiring practices with post-initiative outcomes. Psychology departments studied the cognitive biases that had prevented talent recognition. Sociology programs examined the structural barriers that had perpetuated inequality in knowledge-based industries. The Nobel Committee had created a new category, economic innovation with social impact, specifically to recognize the initiative's contributions to global economic development. Time magazine had named Theo Person of the Year for 2032, with a cover story titled "The Genius We Almost Missed." But on this evening in Davos, as Theo concluded his keynote address, he wasn't thinking about awards or recognition. He was thinking about the email he had received that morning from a 16-year-old girl in Detroit named Amara Jackson. She was living in foster care, teaching herself quantum physics from YouTube videos accessed on public library computers. She had solved a theoretical problem that had puzzled MIT researchers for 6 months and had submitted her solution through the initiative's global talent portal. Amara represented the 4th generation of participants, young people who had grown up in a world where the initiative existed, where they knew that circumstances didn't determine destiny, where they understood that their ideas had value regardless of their zip code or family income. After his speech, Theo found a quiet corner of the Swiss Alpine Lodge where the forum was being held. He pulled out his phone and called Amara directly. "Hello," came a cautious voice, clearly surprised to receive a call from the international number. "Amara, this is Theo Miller. I wanted to thank you for your solution to the quantum entanglement stability problem. It's brilliant work." There was a long pause, then, "You really read it? You really think it's good?" "I think it's revolutionary. And I think you should know that MIT, Caltech, and Cambridge have already submitted formal requests to meet with you. But more importantly, I want you to remember something: your mind is not an accident. Your curiosity is not a luxury. Your ideas matter, and the world needs them." As Theo ended the call and looked out at the snow-covered Alps, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years ago, he had been invisible, dismissed, forgotten by the same industry that now celebrated him. The transformation felt surreal, but it was also deeply logical. Talent had always existed in equal measure across all communities, society had simply lacked the systems to recognize and nurture it. The hypercar repair had been about more than fixing a cooling system. It had been about fixing the systems that cooled human potential, that quantified worth based on appearances instead of capabilities, that assumed genius came with credentials instead of curiosity. Michael approached, carrying 2 cups of Swiss hot chocolate. "The president wants to meet with you tomorrow about expanding the initiative to federal hiring practices. And UNESCO is proposing to make inclusive innovation a human rights framework." Theo accepted the hot chocolate, savoring its warmth against the alpine cold. "It's remarkable how far we've come from a broken car in a Palo Alto parking lot. Sometimes I wonder," Michael mused, "what would have happened if I had just waited for the manufacturer's repair team that day." "Someone else would have recognized the potential eventually," Theo replied. "Genius has a way of surfacing, no matter how many barriers we construct. The question is whether we create systems that accelerate that recognition or systems that delay it indefinitely." As the 2 men stood in comfortable silence, watching the Swiss stars twinkle above the Alpine peaks, they both understood that their partnership had created something larger than either had imagined, a movement that would outlive them both, ensuring that brilliance would be recognized wherever it emerged, regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. The homeless man who had saved a $4.2 million hypercar had helped save something far more valuable: the promise that talent, dedication, and innovation would always find a way to surface, no matter how deeply buried by prejudice or circumstance. 7 years later, that promise had become reality for millions of people worldwide. And the movement continued to grow. 20 years had passed since the transformative morning when smoke first billowed from the quantum nova in Silicon Valley. The world had fundamentally changed, shaped by ripples that began with one homeless man's courage to offer help when it was least expected and most needed. Theo Miller, now 68, stood in the Theodore Miller Center for Innovation Equity at Stanford University, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as the latest cohort of Innovation Recovery Initiative participants filed into the state-of-the-art laboratory complex. His reflection in the glass showed silver hair and the lines of someone who had lived through extraordinary transformation, but his eyes retained the same quiet intensity that had once convinced a skeptical billionaire to trust him with impossible repair work. The center bore his name, but Theo insisted on working from the same modest office he had occupied for 15 years. The walls were covered not with awards, though he had received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and honorary doctorates from 47 universities, but with photographs of initiative graduates who were now changing the world in their own right. Dr. Amara Jackson, the former foster child from Detroit who had solved quantum physics problems on library computers, was now leading NASA's mission to Mars as chief engineer for the 2045 Human Settlement Project. Marcus Williams, once homeless and now 75, had revolutionized global energy storage with his graphene technologies, powering sustainable cities across 6 continents. Sarah Chen had become Secretary of Technology under President Harris, implementing nationwide programs that had eliminated the digital divide by ensuring every American had access to high-speed internet and advanced technological education. The statistics were staggering, but Theo had learned long ago that numbers only captured part of the story. The Innovation Recovery Initiative now operated in 89 countries, had identified and developed over 3.2 million individuals, and had generated technologies worth an estimated $47 trillion in global economic value. Patent filings from initiative participants averaged 127,000 annually, covering everything from climate change mitigation to quantum computing to medical biotechnology. But the deeper transformation was cultural. The term credential bias had entered the common vocabulary. Fortune 500 companies now allocated 25% of their hiring budget specifically to initiative-affiliated recruitment programs. Medical schools, law schools, and MBA programs had restructured their admissions processes to prioritize demonstrated problem-solving ability over traditional academic pedigree. The Theo Miller test had become standard practice in elite institutions. Would this selection process have identified our founders if they had applied without credentials? Michael Rogers, now 72 and recently retired as chairman of Pinnacle Innovations, joined Theo at the window. The company he had built was now the world's largest technology corporation, but its leadership team included former truck drivers, community college graduates, refugees, ex-convicts, and former homeless individuals alongside traditional Ivy League alumni. The diversity wasn't performative, it was practical. Initiative-trained employees generated innovation metrics that consistently exceeded industry standards by 400 to 600%. The Chinese delegation wants to expand their program to rural provinces, Michael reported, reviewing his tablet. And the African Union is requesting technical assistance for establishing innovation centers in 47 nations. The European Parliament passed the Miller-Rogers Directive requiring all EU member states to implement inclusive talent identification programs by 2027. Theo nodded absently, his attention focused on a young woman in the laboratory below who was explaining quantum neural networks to a group of visiting high school students from East Oakland. Dr. Maria Santos Rodriguez had grown up in the same shelter where Theo had once volunteered. She was now 29, held 12 patents in artificial intelligence, and was leading research that promised to revolutionize human-computer interfaces. More importantly, she had never forgotten where she came from. The laboratory door opened, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez from UC Berkeley entered, carrying a thick portfolio. Now director of the Global Innovation Equity Research Consortium, she had spent 2 decades studying the initiative's methodologies and outcomes. Her work had become foundational to understanding how societies could systematically identify and develop human potential. The longitudinal study results are remarkable, she announced, setting the portfolio on Theo's desk. 20-year tracking of initiative participants shows career trajectory improvements averaging 847% compared to control groups from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. But the really extraordinary finding is the second-generation effect. Children of initiative participants are entering advanced STEM programs at 23 times the rate of their demographic peers. Theo smiled. The second-generation effect had been his secret hope from the beginning. Transforming individual lives was meaningful, but transforming cultural expectations about what was possible, that was how permanent change happened. President Chen of Taiwan called while they were reviewing the study data. After exchanging pleasantries in Mandarin, a language Theo had learned during his frequent consulting trips to Asia, she requested initiative assistance in developing quantum technology capabilities for smaller nations. Brain drain was being replaced by brain circulation as initiative-trained researchers chose to work in their home countries, knowing they would be valued and supported. The transformation extended far beyond technology. Dr. James Patterson, the former Marine who had struggled with homelessness, was now Director of Veterans Affairs, implementing programs that had reduced veteran homelessness by 94% nationwide. Initiative-inspired methodologies were being applied to criminal justice reform, educational equity, and economic development in regions historically marginalized by traditional institutions. Hollywood had produced 17 films based on initiative participant stories, but Theo's favorite remained a children's animated movie that depicted talent as seeds scattered equally everywhere, waiting for the right conditions to grow. The film's message, "Genius doesn't have an address," had become a generational touchstone. As evening approached, Theo walked through the Stanford campus toward the spot where a monument now marked the location of his original hypercar repair. The Moment of Recognition Memorial featured a simple bronze plaque embedded in the asphalt, reading, "Here, courage met opportunity, and the world changed." Students often gathered there to study, as if proximity to the site might inspire their own moments of breakthrough. Amara Jackson called from the International Space Station, where she was conducting final systems checks before the Mars mission launch. "Theo," her voice crackled through the connection, "I wanted you to know, the quantum propulsion system we're using for Mars is based on principles you developed during your homeless years. You literally sketched the foundation for interplanetary travel on discarded newspaper in a public library." That night, Theo sat in his modest Palo Alto apartment. He had never moved into anything elaborate, preferring simplicity, and opened his laptop to write his daily email to current initiative participants worldwide. 20 years later, he still personally corresponded with every person in the program, offering encouragement, technical advice, and reminders that their voices mattered. "Innovation," he typed, "is not about individual genius, it's about collective possibility. Every breakthrough emerges from the accumulated insights of countless minds, most of which remain invisible to history. Your contribution, whatever form it takes, is part of a conversation that spans generations. Make it count." As he prepared for sleep, Theo reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with desperation in a Silicon Valley parking lot. The homeless man who had been dismissed as worthless had helped reshape global understanding of human potential. But the real victory wasn't personal recognition, it was systemic transformation. Children growing up today lived in a world where circumstances didn't determine destiny, where talent was recognized wherever it emerged, where second chances were embedded in institutional structures rather than dependent on individual charity. The initiative had become so successful that it was working toward making itself unnecessary, creating societies that naturally identified and nurtured human potential without requiring special programs. Looking out at the Silicon Valley skyline, where innovation centers now operated in every neighborhood, Theo understood that he had witnessed something remarkable, proof that genius was evenly distributed across all demographics, that systemic barriers were human constructions that could be systematically dismantled, and that courage, however small, could create changes that outlived the people brave enough to act. The last thing he saw before sleep was a text message from a 14-year-old girl in rural Bangladesh who had designed a water purification system using initiative methodologies learned through their global online platform. Her innovation would provide clean water to 50,000 people in her region. 20 years after saving a $4.2 million hypercar, Theo Miller fell asleep knowing that the most valuable thing he had ever repaired was humanity's faith in its own limitless potential.